the Honorable Robert Ray, who was Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Canada to the United Nations. Ambassador Ray served as the Premier of Ontario from 1990 to 1995 and was interim leader of the Liberal Party of Canada from 2011 to 2013. He was elected to federal and provincial parliaments 11 times between 1978 and 2013. He received his honors BA in modern history from the University of Toronto and his master's in politics as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University. He graduated from the University of Toronto Faculty of Law in 1977 and was named a Queen's Counsel in 1984. We are honored to hear from you, Ambassador. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you tonight. I think we all recognize the seriousness of this day, of this anniversary. This is also the day in which the United Nations has passed a resolution indicating that this will be a day in which the issue of Islamophobia will be addressed globally. And so it is, I think, even more significant that we are holding this event on this particular anniversary. I just want to say a few things to everyone. The first one is that we need to understand the roots of white supremacy thinking and how widespread it is. And frankly, how deeply ingrained it is in our cultures. As has already been said, the issue of anti-Indigenous racism has been part of the culture of Canada for a very long time. We have struggled against it. We have struggled to overcome it. But in the process of truth and reconciliation, we've had to recognize how deeply seated it is in our historic ways of thinking. I think looking particularly at that issue is important for Canadians and for North Americans to understand that the arrival of European settlers in North America was, and not only in North America, but in fact all over the Americas, was featured some very serious and deep-seated strains of, first of all, religious superiority, racial superiority, and a great deal of violence. And these are historical facts. This is not rhetorical talking here. This is actually what the birth of our national experience was all about. More broadly, I think we can say that the rivalry between different empires, the rivalry between different religious groups has been a feature of our life, not just for a few hundred years, but for a few thousand years, and understand how that has been very much a feature of the thinking and the acting and the way of behaving that has led us to where we are today. We can't imagine our current globe without understanding the nature of imperial thinking. Imperial thinking is shared by a great many different cultures and countries, and it's always imbued with a sense of exceptionalism, a sense of mission, a sense of superiority, which is allegedly born based in very much the cultures of imperial countries, and conflict between imperial countries and what other peoples has been a feature of world history for millennia. So I mention this only because it seems to me we have to kind of situate where we are and understand that these issues did not suddenly arise because of the Oklahoma bombing or because of the awful situation in Christchurch or other terrible examples. It's arisen out of a long process that we have to come to terms with before we can successfully overcome it. I think it's increasingly being understood in governments around the world that this terrorism of the new right or of white supremacists or of whatever groups we come together at various places and various times to express their thinking really came to a head in a sense in Europe in the middle of the 20th century or after the First World War, when racialized thinking took hold of right-wing thinking in Germany and Italy, and even in the Japanese relationship with other cultures in Korea and China. You can see clear signs of people thinking that they, again, going back over the ground, they think they're exceptional, they think they're special, they think they have a unique mission, they think they're called by God, or they're called by some supernatural force to carry out what they refer to as a civilizing mission, in which what happens to others is in terms of violence and conquest is simply a natural expression of the survival of the fittest. In the 19th century, Darwin was misused and abused by a lot of racialized thinking and distinct sort of thinking that this was a scientific theory, that the theory of genetic superiority tied in very much to this sense. Previously, it had been more spiritual superiority or political superiority or simply the superiority of power. But then it took on a kind of, quote, scientific notion, which is bogus science, but nevertheless has had tremendous power and tremendous force. In the United States, of course, we can see slavery as an expression of it. But it's important to recognize that slavery was not just an American phenomenon. Slavery was a global phenomenon in which the alleged superiority of whites over blacks was expressed. The wars of the Crusades were fought between Christians and Muslims on the premise that one religion was superior to the other and that one religion had the right to be in a certain place and the other religion did not have a right to be in a certain place. So there are clear religious overtones to the nature of this phenomenon that we see with its strands still alive today. The Russian Empire had senses of its own superiority over other nations and other races. And we're seeing signs of that today in the position that's being taken by President Putin with respect to Ukraine, where he doesn't recognize the separateness or the otherness of Ukraine or its right to independence or to chart its own course. So those theories of racial superiority become part of his way of thinking and his way of acting as well. It's important to understand that this is a complex phenomenon. It's not a simple phenomenon. But it's also important to understand how widespread it is and how deeply, as I said before, embedded it is in some of our cultures and some of our ways of thinking. So here am I, a 73-year-old social democrat, liberal, pluralist, the product of both Jewish and Christian culture, struggling to understand where do liberal values go in the face of this kind of terrorism and violence. And here am I also, and I mention my age not because I think I've had it or I'm past it, but because I recognize that the technologies which are at work today have become instruments of hate. The internet has we thought the internet was going to be a place that allowed people to learn. It would be like a university of the air, in which everybody would be learning and sharing information. Instead, we find that the internet is a cauldron of hatred, misinformation, disinformation, lying, propaganda, which is allowed to take over people's minds and it infects them with these crazy ideas. 4 years ago, I was asked by the Prime Minister to try and understand better the crisis in Myanmar that had led to the expulsion of nearly 1 million Muslim Rohingya refugees from that country into Bangladesh. And I went there thinking, not knowing a lot about the nature of the ethnic conflict, but coming away with a profound sense, which I'd had 20 years before, in looking at the conflict between Buddhists and Hindus in Sri Lanka, where racial hatred and senses of racial difference and racial superiority were dominant features in have been dominant features in both of those conflicts. And in the case of Myanmar, where the internet was able to feed immediately, because the country did not have any internet, no social media were allowed. So suddenly you had an experiment where in 2005, the military said, let's have the internet, let that happen. What happened? The internet became the basis upon which Facebook became the platform of preference for those people who are spreading hate and spreading violence. And now we see the result of that in a conflict, not only with the Rohingya, but a conflict by the military, which represents the Bamar plurality of the country, and a sense of the superiority and the sense of the vulnerability of the Buddhist culture in the face of all the forces of modernism around them, and asserting that their nationalism is the best means of expression, and carrying that out through a process of terrible violence against various minority groups and other racial and religious groups which exist in the country. It's an appalling situation. So I mention this from the global perspective because we need to understand how it's not limited in time or place to one country, how it is a global phenomenon, but it's not as easy to categorize as perhaps other forms of revolutionary extremism or terrorist activity of one kind and another. But they're all based on the same notion of people having a mission, people having a sacred mission, people having a responsibility to carry out political acts against innocent people, to kill innocent people in the name of God, or in the name of racial superiority, or in the name of theoretical or ideological superiority. And all of them are just appalling. They're terrible ideas. But our problem is that we don't know how to face up to them as effectively as we need to. And in the case of white supremacism and white terrorism, if you like, use that term, it's based on, it comes too close to the history of different parts of the world for people to say, wait a minute, we're going to have to deal with this in our midst. We're going to have to deal with this issue, which is our issue. Instead of blaming the other for this, we have to look at ourselves and figure out, where does this stuff come from, and how do we root it out? The good news, and this is what I leave you with, is that I actually do believe governments in the West are getting the message. I think they understand that when you create a plural culture, as we have done in all of our countries to some extent or another, we have a particular responsibility to make sure that everyone is respecting the nature of pluralism, and that everyone has a stake in dealing with extremism, whatever form it takes, whenever it comes. And that we expect our intelligence services that work on our behalf, and our police services that work on our behalf, and our military that work on our behalf, to be aware of the presence of these forces and to deal with them as they spew hatred and spew violence. It's not an easy thing to do, because our notions of liberalism are sometimes based on the fact that we live and let live, that we don't engage in dealing with hate until it takes on the form of violence. That as long as it's not directly creating violence, that we just say, well, it's just there. There's nothing to be done about it, and we have to just reason with it and hope that it will somehow magically go away. But the reality is it doesn't go away. It doesn't go away unless it's combated effectively, and unless we understand better what its roots and origins and what are the forces at work that make for its success. I have to say that it's primarily a male phenomenon. And so it's based not only on ideas of superiority as it relates to race or religion, but also gender. It's frequently accompanied by gender violence. And the authoritarian personality, as Theodor Adorno, the great German-American sociologist, described it many years ago, the authoritarian personality has a problem with any of these challenges to their unilateral power or their ability to take over and abuse other people. So in short, my friends, it's a challenge. It's a real challenge for the world. And it's a challenge that I think we have to all take much more seriously than we have. There's more studying of it going on. There's more documentation of it going on. There's more, I think, sense that we have to work hard to root it out and to deal with it and to identify it as the very threatening force that it can be. And we have to be aware that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, as has been said, that in fact, our freedom requires us to deal with those who would use our freedom against us. And that, I think, is something that's hard sometimes for people to fully understand and embrace. We have to be more resilient in the face of an intolerance that will, in fact, destroy us if we don't deal with it. And that isn't about making thoughts a crime, but it is about understanding that hatred festers. It festers on inequality. It festers on a sense of grievance. It festers on economies that are not fair or just. It festers in worlds in which people have fewer chances and fewer freedoms and fewer abilities to express themselves than they think they should have. I think we're seeing and experiencing this, the irrationality of some of it in many of its different forms. So I can only tell you that here at the United Nations, I feel a certain, an even greater sense of responsibility to speak out about it in a way that makes it clear that it is these forms of hatred can actually infect any culture, and they can take many, many different forms. And it's important for us to understand that no culture is immune to it, because we've seen, just in my little historical survey, you can see all the examples where it's still there and where it expresses itself in forms that are violent and that are dangerous and that represent a threat to the peace of the world. So I'll leave it at that. I could go on longer, as my friends know. When I get riled, I can go on a bit, but I really appreciate the chance to speak to you. I think this is an important occasion. I think it's an important opportunity for people to think and hear about the extent to which this is a problem. And finally, I think it's really important that everyone feel that it's partly about them, but it's also not about them. And I don't want anyone to feel that somehow they are alone, that they face these forces of hatred by themselves, and that essentially they're the only ones who can deal with it, and therefore they're going to have to take things into their own hands. It's up to our sense of solidarity to make it clear that we are going to be living for the foreseeable future in a world of different religions, in a world of different values, in a world of different perspectives. We're going to have to figure out how to get along with each other, but we're also going to have to figure out how to be stronger in the face of hatred. And the thing we know about hatred is that one day it'll come after you if you don't stop it from coming after somebody else. And I think that's a lesson that we've all had to learn. History of the 20th century has been a difficult training ground. We haven't always applied the lessons that we should have learned, but we have to come to grips with its impact. and why this is so important. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be with all of you. Sorry I can't stay. I have something else on my plate. No rest for the wicked, as they say. But I really appreciate your coming together and look forward very much to hearing about the outcome of all of your deliberations. Thank you very, very much.